I've been thinking about writing the book for a long time, primarily first as a kind of ethnography of programmers for people who don't know anything about programming. And then it occurred to me that a nice entrance into that subject for me would be to deal with the aesthetics of code and how beauty is construed and searched for in two kinds of language, right? Because coders also deal with language. So I guess the first sort of task in the book is to convince people that programmers are actually concerned with elegance and beauty. And there's a very practical reason for it in that you're not really writing code for the machine, you're writing it for all the other programmers who are going to follow you, maybe 20 years down the line to try and figure out your code. So there's a great emphasis placed on clarity, on expressiveness, and on elegance. In the same way, I think somewhat similar to what mathematicians and physicists do in their work. So the book then becomes a kind of meditation on what beauty means in terms of a formal language, and then what beauty means in terms of poetry or literary language. So there's a very interesting connection between ancient India and the world that we live in now that is so dominated by code. In that, in about 500 BCE, Panini produced the Ashtadhyayi, which literally means 8 chapters. So it's a grammar. But it's not a grammar in the traditional sense that you and I might have encountered in second grade. It's not a paradigmatic grammar that shows you, these are the ways that the verb go occurs in all its declensions. It's actually a rule set. And it's a 3,976 rules that work on roots and on verb roots and nominal stems and on words itself. So what you do is, suppose you want a word which is in first person singular active agent, right? So what you do is you pop that root into the system and these rules start going off, and at each step they change the sound a little bit. And by the time that you come out at the other end, you'll have the complete word you need. So it's an amazing feat considering the time that it took place in, considering also its compression. You can print the whole thing out in about 40 pages of text. And possibly might have been done completely in an oral culture, right? Without the aid of writing. It might have been written down later. So it has an interesting career both within India and outside. It becomes the most influential grammar in Sanskrit and completely formalizes the language so that it kind of halts the natural language drift, right, that other languages experience over the centuries. And it's discovered by the West in the 18th century. It first gets translated by the Germans, and then finally the entire European scientific community discovers this. And it becomes one of the very important bases for all of modern linguistics, right? Because Ferdinand de Saussure, for instance, who we now know as the father of structural linguistics, was a Sanskrit professor. So was Leonard Bloomfield, who set the direction of American linguistics in the 20th century. Noam Chomsky, with his generative linguistics, talks a lot about his debt to Panini. So then in the mid-1940s and early 50s, programmers are trying to figure out how do you construct formal languages for the computer, right? Because you can't just speak to a computer or write for the computer in a free and easy syntax, right? Because it'll get very confused. So you need a language that is very tightly constrained by rules. And that, of course, then they discover or they generate by setting up what you could call linguistic formulae, right? That like a rule set that works in certain ways. And that actually, if you look at it closely, it completely resembles the Paninian structure of defining a language. So much so that in the late 60s, an American programmer wrote to the Association of Computing Machinery Journal and suggested that they should change its name. It's called the Backus-Naur form after the two computer scientists who developed it in the 50s, and he said it should be called the Panini-Backus form. Right? Using Sanskrit as a kind of link between the world of formal languages and the world of literary language became like a very interesting and lovely kind of correspondence for me to explore. I think it's the nature of it as an autobiography has been somewhat exaggerated, because I don't really, tell my tragedies and loves in my 20s at all. But what I did use part of my own history was for because I talk about how I discovered the pre-modern Indian literary tradition, and that was while I was trying to write my first novel, and I was trying to find an architecture for it. I was trying to find a vocabulary to talk about the kind of effects that I wanted in the literature. And so through A.K. Ramanujan's work, I discovered this whole enormous, thousands of years old tradition of very sophisticated thinking about language and poetry and art. And so that's what I then I finally end up using in order to try and understand what is it about poetic language that makes it distinct from other kinds of languages. There's a lot of stuff in the book, right? So we already talked about some. We talked about programming in the modern sense. We've talked about Sanskrit, pre-modern Indian literary theory, and then of course literature and technology and aesthetics are not things that float up in some sort of abstract space. They're always grounded in a very particular history of politics, and especially gender politics. So the book then also addresses gender politics in terms of Silicon Valley and its problems with sexism, and then also looks at the role of women in the tradition of Indian literature, right? We know that they were big producers, but the canon looks very male. So why does that happen? So I think what everyone was trying to do was to try and find some title that would somehow magically get all of this together in a few words. And so then people came up with different solutions. My original title that I started with when I was thinking of it as a short essay was Geek Sublime. And then that generally got transformed along the way.